and I'll be moderating the conversation today. I am a senior advisor for the Center for Earth Ethics in New York City, which is hosting the session today. I also am the co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, which is a Hindu environmental organization. I'm also happy to serve on the advisory board for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I want to start our time here today by explaining a little bit about these dialogues or consultations that we are conducting with the Center for Earth Ethics and laying the groundwork for our conversation today before we get into the conversation and dialogue with our esteemed guests. So I'm going to share my screen briefly just to give So we at the Center for Earth Ethics are conducting a series of consultations that explore ecosystem restoration through the lens of spirituality, values, and culture. We believe that when we talk about ecosystem restoration, that there are many drivers of mobilization to move people into action and advocacy. And we believe that spirituality, values, and culture are a lens through which we can engage people from across different religious, spiritual, and cultural traditions. So started last month and through to the end of July, we are holding a series of consultations. We conducted one on air and air pollution in St. James Parish in the United States, and that took place about a month ago. Today, we are talking about rivers in India. And then by the end of July, we'll be conducting consultations on cities, food, and species. And if you'd like to take part in those consultations, please stay to the end of today, where we'll be sharing how you can be informed when those consultations are taking place. But today we are talking about the river Yamuna, a river in India. Here is a map of it. It starts off in the Himalayas and from the source of Yamuna, and comes down through Delhi, through Agra, before it joins the Ganges River in Allahabad or Prayagraj. I won't go too much into the detail of the flow of the river because we have a panel of experts who are much more versed in the river itself. But this is just to set the context for the flow. But in like many things in India, there's we can say a material lens by which we can look at it, but also a spiritual lens as well. And for many people in India, the river Yamuna is also a goddess. This is her depicted here. And she is worshipped and venerated by many people, not just in India, but globally as well. And she is venerated because she is a goddess, but also because she is closely associated with the stories of the Hindu god Krishna. On the left here, you'll see a depiction of Krishna as he's carried over the Yamuna by his father. He was born on the banks of the Yamuna. On the right is an image of Krishna dancing on the heads of a serpent snake that had poisoned the river Yamuna. And so because of these reasons, because the Yamuna is a goddess and because she is so closely associated with the stories of Krishna, that she is venerated and worshipped. And we'll hear more about that in the dialogue today. Unfortunately, the present day reality is that the Yamuna is very heavily polluted, and some consider her to be a dead river due to the extremely high levels of toxins and poisonous chemicals in the river. You see here this image, or similar images may be familiar to some of you, that when the river reaches Delhi, a lot of the river is diverted for agriculture use, for use by the city of Delhi. And once the river leaves Delhi, all that remains is untreated sewage water. And so images like this are very, I would say, heartbreaking, but very common to see, that Hindu pilgrims and other devotees will worship in the river Yamuna, surrounded by toxic foam. And unfortunately, this is the plight of the Yamuna, but also many other sacred rivers in India. And so this dialogue will seek to understand how this situation came about, but most crucially, how we can point to solutions using this lens of spirituality, values, and culture through a multi-stakeholder approach to find solutions to restore the river Yamuna. And I'm so delighted for our wonderful expert panelists today. We have Srivatsa Goswami, who is the Acharya of the Radharaman Mandir in Vrindavan. We have Mr. Atul Baghai, who is the head of the country office for the United Nations Environment Program in India. We have Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, the Biodiversity Program Coordinator for ICLEI South Asia, working with local governments for sustainability. And then we have Geeta Parihar, who is an environmental advocate and lawyer based in the United Kingdom. So a wonderful, illustrious panel for what we hope to be a very insightful conversation. The structure of our session today is that we will have a dialogue with our esteemed panelists for about 40 to 50 minutes, maybe a bit longer. And then we'll have time for taking questions from the audience as well. So if you're a participant, please do put questions in the panel. And please also put in who you are and where you're dialing in from, so we know the range of people that we have with us today. So I would like to start with Srivatsa Goswami ji. Maharaj, we have known each other for a number of years. I've had the honor of meeting you and spending time with you at your ashram there in Vrindavan, which is right on the banks of the Yamuna. And you are the Acharya, a leader in the Radharaman Mandir, which is one of the oldest temples in Vrindavan, the town where Krishna lived as a child, and your family have been custodians of that temple and the town by extension for many, many generations, for hundreds of years. And you've been involved in cultural awareness and the religious significance of the Yamuna in international forums, and helping understand why the preservation of the Yamuna is such an important task for religious reasons, but also cultural reasons, health reasons, and so on. So I'm wondering, Maharaj, could you enlighten us and talk more about the religious and the cultural significance of the Yamuna in the context of your tradition, please?
I think, Gopal, when you're talking about the ecosystem which is affecting the human reality, there could not be a better focus than River Yamuna, which represents the water element in our life. And the Hindu understanding is, based on the scientific experience, that it is water which is life. Jalam vai jivana. So with that basic understanding, I switch to what you were showing in your introductory remarks about the culture and religiosity based upon the tradition of Krishna. And that is one of the most spread out and major religious group among the Hindus. So if we see Yamuna from that context, the Krishnite context, and for rightly so, because Krishna has the most right on Yamuna. If anybody has any right on Yamuna, it is one person, which is Krishna. So Yamuna is the essential identifier of Braj, the sacred geography associated with Krishna. Because when Krishna wanted to come in and intervene in human history, he was told to go to Braj, the sacred area of Braj. And he said, how will I find Braj? He says, very simple. If you find River Yamuna, if you find Mount Govardhan, and if you find the forest of Vrindavan, all these three together, that is the place where the divinity can play. So Yamuna for Krishna is so sacred and so significant and so essential that, as we all know, that Krishna as the supreme being is in love with the whole of creation. And that is represented through his infinite loves called the gopis. But Krishna's pastimes, which are spread in 3 geographical locations and 3 time sectors, sections, which is Vraj, Mathura, and Dwarika. There is only one love of Krishna who remains with him. It is not his chief Shakti Radha who travels with him to Mathura. Neither it is Rukmini who is available in Vrindavan and Mathura, etc. It is only Yamuna, which never parts company with Krishna, or you can say the God never parts company with this river. Wherever and whatever time he is playing is with the river. Secondly, as far as Vrindavan and Vrindavan related religiosity is concerned, no temple ritual is complete without Yamuna's water. I cannot go in details of that, but when the pilgrims come to Vrindavan, and there's a huge footprint, there were 3.5 crores, how many, that is 30 million, more than 35 million people visiting last year, despite the COVID and all, you can imagine what kind of footprint Vrindavan has, the pilgrims. And the major activity, the fundamental activity of a pilgrim visiting, say, Vrindavan is to visit river, have a dip, and do Vranda Puja and Yamuna Puja. That is the ritual, an essential pilgrim's ritual, which has to be participated and performed. Secondly, culturally, to sum up, I will just say that in our area, no Hindu can significantly take birth, cannot live, cannot perform marriage alliances or other sacraments of life, and cannot even die if Yamuna is not present as a witness to the life cycle of a Hindu. So I think that is what I see. But if we come to the next stage of that how we see Yamuna situation affect the religiosity and the pilgrims' activity and the devotional activities. I will say whatever I have enumerated and pointed out, all these factors will be severely affected if we are not concerned for Yamuna. The most serious challenge is to keep Yamuna's sanctity alive. We are talking about the purity and hygiene of the water, but there is something deeper than that where Yamuna becomes significant, and that is the sanctity of the water, the sacredness of the water called Yamuna. And how long, as you pointed out, Gopal, how long can we pretend to accept, respect, and worship a drain as a sacred river and a goddess, which is solely surviving on the treated and untreated urban sewage, especially in Delhi and beyond Delhi? So this respect and faith in Yamuna is the result of many millenniums of Hindu practices and interaction with the river. Millenniums go into the making of that faith relationship, respectful relation to the water body, Yamuna. Once that faith is lost, that sacredness is lost, Yamuna will disappear. What will remain? Only a polluted or unpolluted water body will survive, and that will not be Yamuna.
Thank you so much, Maharaji, for outlining the cultural significance, but also the real almost the spiritual calling that we have, which you articulated at the end, which is how long can we, I like how you framed it, how long can we worship a drain? which is literally what is happening, for many years now. Thank you so much. I do want to come back with you with more questions, but I want to move to Atul Baghai, who is the head of country office for the United Nations Environment Programme. Atul ji, thank you so much for being with us this evening. I know it's a busy time at UNEP with Stockholm plus 50 just a couple of days away, and then World Environment Day. So I know you're busy, and I understand you may have to drop off a bit earlier than initially planned. And I would love, Atul ji, for you to speak to the role of the United Nations Environment Programme when we talk about the restoration of the river Yamuna, but also the broader context of restoring ecosystems across India. Because India is a land of many faith traditions and spiritualities and cultures. And you, with your office there in partnership with the Faith for Earth program, headed by Dr. Iyad Abamogli out of Nairobi, have launched the Faith for Earth Counselor program, working with different faith communities for environmental leadership. And so I'm wondering, Atul ji, could you speak to why faith-based engagement is important for the UN Environment Program in India?
Thank you for inviting UNEP for this very, very important event. And I was looking at the participants who are joining this important event from almost all the corners of the world. First, on behalf of UNEP, I would like to welcome all the panelists, my co-panelists, and my special Charan Sparsh to Swamiji, whom I've listened for the last 35 years and have had the privilege of listening to him in Vrindavan through many holy functions at the temple. And it has been a rare privilege and an honor to be part of this most amazing events that are organized under his stewardship. I would like to highlight 2 or 3 aspects before I move to why are faith-based organizations so very important. As the Secretary General and our Executive Director have been talking about a triple planetary crisis of climate, crisis of pollution, and crisis of nature that the whole world is facing nowadays. And in fact, the Secretary General has sounded the code red as far as climate is concerned. And it's not only climate change that is so very important for us to address, but what you're talking about, the ecosystem restoration, that is so very important. It's closely linked to climate change. In fact, the whole world community over the last 24 months plus has witnessed the drastic COVID pandemic, which has not left even a single human being untouched. And we are talking of 7 billion human beings who were impacted by this. Now, if you consider the reasons behind how this pandemic came about, there are scientific studies to show, and UNEP has been part of some of those, that this zoonotic disease was also largely due to the ecosystem loss that we all saw in the last 40 to 50 years. So what Swamiji was talking of, our traditional respect towards our ecosystems over the last millennial years, I think we have forgotten all that and have played with the nature around us in the last 40, 50 years in a way that it led to a pandemic like COVID. So from that perspective, I think this event today is so very important because our focus is on how do we restore a river like Yamuna, but not only a river like Yamuna, but how do we restore our whole ecosystem? And that is the important challenge we are facing. And the UN recognized that. And on 5th June 2021, just about a year back, the UN launched the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And this decade was launched precisely for the reason that unless we mend our ecosystem, our biodiversity, our rivers, our forests, our mountains, we will not be in a position to have a safe life for the 7 billion or 10 billion population that is going to be by 2050. Now, that's where I think within that global context, I would like to highlight uh, where this whole cleaning of Yamuna river can get contextualized. And that's a very, very important global context that needs to be understood. And then that global context needs to be brought down to local action on river Yamuna. Now, how do faith organizations help? And you rightly pointed out the Faith for Earth initiative that UNEP launched with IAD spearheading it at a global level. And we are very fortunate that because of the immense reach of faith-based organizations in India, we were able to develop a strategy for faith-based organizations in India. And India is the only developing and developed country globally that now has a strategic approach to working with faith-based organizations. And I'm so very proud and happy to say that we are working so closely with so many faith-based organizations in India. And the reason why we in India chose to work with faith-based organizations and we got tremendous response are two or threefold. And I'll like to highlight those. In Indian tradition, nature has been given a very prominent position. In fact, our old scriptures, whatever religion they may be, talk about our respect for nature and looks at the human beings as their moral duty to be preserving the nature around them. If you look at our culture, when we get up in the morning from our bed and we put our feet on the ground for the first time in the day, we start by not only worshipping Mother Earth, but by apologizing from Mother Earth that please forgive me for putting my feet on you, which is in Indian tradition looked as disrespectful. And then they go ahead not only worshipping Mother Earth, but also preserving nature. Now, if that is the whole context in which Indian traditions and Indian culture works, there can be no better way of using and working and supporting faith-based organizations to propagate the ideas of sustainable development and to propagate the idea of environment amongst the followers of a particular faith-based organization. Well, it is very well known that spiritual values drive individual behaviors for more than almost 80% of the global population. So it's got such a powerful reach that if you want to make a change on this planet, there is no more effective way than of bringing the faith-based organizations on the center stage and also working with them to take forward the environmental value systems that are so very needed in the present scenario. If you, and I'm sure you will all agree that faith-based organizations have globally been recognized as key players not only in sustainable development but in eradicating poverty, in improving people's health, of course, protecting the environment and working towards sustainable development are areas where the faith-based organizations have and are playing such an important role. So I'll try to conclude by saying that faith-based engagement is very, very important to inspire and to empower faith organizations and their leaders to advocate for protecting the environment, to green faith-based organizations, investments and assets to support the implementation of sustainable development goals, And finally, to provide them with knowledge and networks to enable their leaders to effectively communicate with decision makers and the public. I can give you hundreds of examples of how this has been done in India through through the Swamiji who's present here and through his organization, through the many other organizations, whether they are from the Sikhism or Islam or various denominations of Hindu religion, the Jains, the Christians. There are so many innumerable examples of how faith-based organizations in India are turning the whole narrative of moving towards environmental sustainability. In fact, I can give a very recent example, and without ignoring the significance of all the efforts that are going on by all faith-based organizations. The recent Save the Soil of Isha Foundation by Sadhguru has raised so much of awareness on an area which was so neglected of preserving our soil, which is so very important. In fact, I understand that on 5th June, which is the World Environment Day, the Prime Minister would be speaking to the nation on soil along with the Sadhguru. And there are so many other events that are going to be organized on World Environment Day on 5th by all the organizations with whom we have been working. So it's really heartening to be working with the faith-based organizations, and we feel privileged to be part of the work that is going on. And we would like to keep on supporting and working and make our humble contribution to the tremendous work that the faith-based organizations are doing in India.
Thank you so much, Atulji, for your remarks and for your continued support, both personally and through your office there as the head of country office for UNEP, for supporting and lifting up faith-based action when it comes to the environment, the SDGs, for health, for all the areas. So thank you so much, and really setting the context for why this is important for UNEP in India. And the real, as you said, this has been happening for many, many years, for many generations, we can say, in India. And the fact that the UN is recognizing that and giving a platform is really a way to kind of say that we want this to increase and strengthen in the years to come. So thank you so much. I know that you may have to drop off soon after, because as I mentioned, I think you may have to have some other meetings, but thank you so much for your time today and your remarks. It really helps us frame
Thanks.
this.
I am, my apologies, because I would have loved to be part of this conversation, and I'm certainly going to later on look at the recording, but I need to leave for another meeting. But before I leave, I just wanted to thank all the faith-based organizations and their leaders. And I just wanted to give a suggestion to all the participants, especially from an Indian culture perspective, and also from the perspective of our traditions. And Swamiji will certainly bear me out and support what I'm suggesting, that in our Indian tradition, we respect our guests like gods. We have this saying of Atithi Devo Bhav, that the guest is like a god. And I wanted to take that narrative a little further, where in our mindsets and in our cultural traditions, we could start rekindling the old traditions of our million of years of Prakriti Devo Bhav, that the nature should be treated like God. And if that's what this whole narrative which Swamiji was giving of the linkages between Lord Krishna and River Yamuna, if Prakriti of nature can be looked upon as God, I think half our battle of climate mitigation or our environmental mitigation will be won. Thank you very much.
Thank you much, Atulji, and that's a wonderful suggestion that we look at nature as God. And that takes me to our next speaker, Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, who is the Biodiversity Program Coordinator at ICLEI South Asia, working with local governments for sustainability. And Dr. Sen is based in Delhi, and she has worked with rivers across India and the Yamuna also specifically, and has over 14 years of experience working on biodiversity conservation. Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, I'm wondering if you could speak to the situation of the Yamuna. Obviously, I alluded to it in our opening remarks, and Shivatsa Goswamiji and Atulji have spoken about it. But Mona Lisa Sen, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about, in a bit more detail, what are the causes of the pollution of the river Yamuna? How did we get here? If you can enlighten us on that, that would be much appreciated.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon from whichever part of the world you're joining in. Basically, it's already been highlighted by all the previous speakers as well as you. Yamuna, which is one of the most worshipped rivers in the country, is also probably one of the most polluted ones in the entire world now. One of the most significant factors behind this is, of course, the high population rise. Then things like basic services which are not provided or poor are not able to get access to, so they are starting to live along the rivers. A lot of riverbed encroachment has happened. In addition to it, there is huge amount of sewage and industrial waste discharge which is happening into the river. So also added to it is this rapid urbanization and the lack of effective waste disposal systems, and which has all led to a change in the entire characteristic of the river and has impacted the entire riverine ecosystem of the Yamuna. So I would in short, if you want me to ask what is the reason behind Yamuna becoming more like a drain now, it's completely anthropogenic. There is no other reason to it. It's just human interference and a not thoughtful process that we've all been going through. That's what has led to this.
And is this replicated with with rivers across India as well? Is Yamuna a particular case study, or do we find this in other sacred rivers across the country as well?
It's there in most of the sacred rivers of India: Ganga, Narmada, Godavari, Brahmaputra. You just name them, and each one of them is facing the same challenges. It's basically the rapid urbanization and the things that we did not think of that we have to plan before. Maybe building a city or expanding a city or providing employment opportunities. That's what led us to this. The sad part of the story is this is a country which respects its rivers in the form of worshipping them, but also does not think twice before dumping waste into the river. So that's the irony of the situation, and that's how most of our rivers are suffering. Once they leave the glaciers, most of our rivers have these different levels of pollution in them.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know there has been some efforts in Delhi regarding restoring of the floodplains. I do want to ask you about that. But I want to bring in our next speaker, Geeta Parihar, who's an environmental advocate and lawyer based in London, also very active with the Hindu community there in the UK. And Geeta, you've worked with international environmental organizations. You campaign for issues like this, but you're also a Hindu, a practicing Hindu, I understand. I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about how this makes you feel as a Hindu who's living outside of India, but still looks to the Yamuna as a source of inspiration, as something worthy of worship, and the dire situation that it's in. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Gopal. So I think it's a situation where you actually feel quite helpless in terms of the direct ability to influence or be part of what's happening or the discussions that are happening in India. I think we grow up with a faith orientation that the entire world is divine, and that these rivers particularly are the most sacred rivers within our tradition, and they represent goddesses. And it goes right back to the laws of Manu, the earliest laws in the tradition, which talk about not putting urine or feces or blood or poison or anything else that's toxic being cast into water. So there's so much of a practical as well as a spiritual framework to draw on. But I think obviously things have changed. Even with Nehru putting the first stone down for the first dam, he declared dams were the new temples, and so there was a new approach, an industrialization approach, which we've seen all across the world really. And that approach, as we're seeing very clearly what the shortcomings of that approach are now all across the world, and in India no less than anywhere else. And I've hiked to the source of the Ganga and the Yamuna and been in those beautiful clear springs where the hot water is coming through, and you're up in the Himalayas. And then as soon as the river comes down onto the plains, the river is dammed. There's all of this. It's basically used as a resource, as something to be exploited and drawn from. And this situation, I think, is really when you're trying to look at what can be done from someone who's not directly involved or living in India, or even born in India. I think there are some real things that we can do, and partly there's raising awareness as the kind of discussions we're having now. There was a film called The Stolen River a few years ago, which was a very powerful exploration by of the pollution impacts, particularly of the production of basmati rice, which is happening in the north. And then it's not designed for the production of that kind of rice, and most of that rice is actually going abroad. So there's direct things that can be done there in terms of consumption. But in terms of political change, or really putting this issue up the agenda, I think it's really trying to support communities on the ground. But our sense, I organised with some friends a screening of this film called The Stolen River, and it really felt like there's almost a sense of hopelessness. There was a real sort of sense of energy that things might move, and that's not happening. And I think it really does need to be led by the communities on the ground. They need the support. They are also in the best position to work out how to manage the river. And we've seen that with other communities in different parts of the world, and in terms of how to manage rivers according to a rights of nature approach. And then, connecting it outside India, connecting it to other parts of the world. For example, in the UK, the report from 2017, I'm not sure what the latest date is, but then 40% of the rivers in the UK are polluted with sewage, and only 14% of them are regarded as healthy. And there are laws which allow just discharge of raw sewage if there's a severe weather event or some other reason. So the laws are really arcane. They're designed for a system in a time where nature was effectively instrumentalized, something just to be used. And we see those laws and the effect of that way of thinking now actually passing throughout the world. And actually within the Hindu tradition, often if you're carrying out a ritual or anything like that, you always invoke the elements in the nearby area, including your nearest river. Most of us here don't know what our nearest river is. And so really trying to establish that connection and joining the dots and saying, okay, these different places and these different incidents are all actually part of a bigger picture, and trying to understand our role within that bigger picture. And for me, that's really within the legal framing, looking at, well, where do these values come from? How do we give? You can say, well, a river doesn't exist as a person, so how can you give it rights? But actually, we do that all the time. We give entities that don't exist rights, and we call them companies. That's an entire cultural fabrication. And so really starting to try and unpack some of these different ways in which we look at things and what is the thinking behind them, and trying to orient towards so many of the traditions in the world, including the one I come from, which have a very, very different viewpoint and a very reverent attitude to rivers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Geeta. There's so much there to unpack, the raising of the awareness, our consumption habits. Obviously, we know that when it comes to biodiversity loss, that one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss is consumption or unsustainable consumption. And you speak there about the rights of nature approach, which is really taking hold in many parts of the world, and then looking at the bigger picture, that recognizing that we're all connected. Some really amazing points there. And Shivatsu Goswamiji, I'm wondering if I can come back to you, because you have really been at the forefront of this work for many, many decades. You started through your own ashram, but also you co-founded Friends of Vrindavan back in the 1990s, I believe, with WWF. And so you've been doing this work. You're both within religious context, but also in what we can call the secular space or the non-religious spaces and development spaces and government spaces. And part of these dialogues are to understand, how do we bring different stakeholders together? So the private sector, governments, philanthropists, religious actors together. And you have really been at that nexus for much of your life. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what have you seen has worked to bridge these divides, to bridge these gaps, so that we can all be singing let's say from the same hymn sheet, so to speak? How do we bring everyone together?
You have hit the nail on the head, actually. And in this whole effort and service to the river or to the environment or to ecology, we should recognize the roles of faith traditions, the economic and political forces alongside. The problem is that if we see these as competitive and opposing forces, then the game is lost. They complement each other, and they should, and they are actually the partners in the common service, say, of Yamuna. So having acknowledged the importance of their respective roles, the role of the faith tradition, the economic forces, the political powers, etc., there has to be a collaborative dialogue amongst them. With the trust in one's own self, if the faith tradition has clarity and conviction and trust in themselves, then it can approach the establishment to implement it for the welfare of all. Such trust building, in my understanding, bears fruits. Like the example of the creation of Vrindavan, the holiest of holy Hindu places, is a great example of this trust building, where Hindu religious leadership in the 16th century interacted with the Mughal court, the imperial powers in Delhi and Agra, and it resulted in an unprecedented economic development of the 16th century India, where India was contributing almost 40% of GDP. And this dialogue between the religion, political, and development or economic forces gave us the platform, gave us the canvas on which the painting of peace and prosperity could be painted. And it became a reality. It became a reality. So this dialogical collaboration, to me, is the key. That is the key. And faith among these players will be strengthened when cultural and religious practices, trade and travels, and development issues will be invigorated from a healthy and a rejuvenated Yamuna. It is imperative on our part for not just for faith reasons, for economic reasons, for aesthetic reasons, for cultural reasons, for political reasons. A healthy and invigorated Yamuna is a prerequisite. So what we will be doing to Yamuna, we will be getting more out of it. And this faith collaboration with the, what you call the civil society, which I take a little offense to use the word, because I do not want to keep the religious traditions and faith traditions as uncivilized forces. They are very much on the top of the pyramid of the civil society. So having said that, and I pardon, you pardon me if I have used a harsh language, and the dialogue does not require harsh languages like this. Sorry for that, but I was part of a very interesting event, which was an initiative of the Prince Philip on one part as a host, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the president of the World Bank. And this culminated into an institution called World Faith Development Dialogue, where the faith-based institutions became the overseers and monitors and conduits and the agents for the World Bank to see the development works progress and monitor it. And we should not be surprised, in 16 countries, our proposals were carried on by the World Bank after several consultations in Lambeth Palace, Buckingham Palace, and Washington, D.C. In the penthouse of the World Bank president, Jim Wolfenson was there. So anyway, you know what happened? The money which was utilized maximum to 27% of the grant given. In 1 year, with the intervention and participation of the faith-based local organization, the utilization of the money went to 84%. 84%. Unfortunately, with the change of guards at the World Bank, the practice was dropped. The civilized society wanted to become uncivilized again. So this wonderful practice of collaborating with the faith organizations for economic and development work, purely economic and development work, infrastructure work, educational and medical work, faith-based organizations did their wonderful participation. So it is possible. So that is something which I feel is this thing. And if I can guess your question, second question, continuing on that, what does inner restoration look or feel like for each of us? But I'm wondering what you mean by inner restoration. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, I want to come to some other points. So if we can come back to that question shortly, if that's okay, Maharaji. I'm sure many of us could sit here and listen to you all day, but I want to bring in lift up some of the points you were just speaking to there. And because you're pointing to some success stories, which are really important, which give us some enthusiasm and optimism that actually this can work. And I learned just recently from my conversations with Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, and Dr. Sen, I would like to switch to you now, is you were talking to me about the projects going on in Delhi itself in terms of restoring some of the Yamuna floodplains in Delhi. So I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit about the motivation behind the authorities in Delhi to restore the floodplains. And there's a question that came in the Q&A, which is that the Delhi government is claiming that 90% of wastewater is being treated before it is discharged into the Yamuna, but there doesn't seem to be any significant improvements on that. So Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's actually going on in the city of Delhi, because we recognize that it is, in many ways, the city of Delhi is one of the main culprits for the pollution of the Yamuna. So Dr. Sen, I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so the city of Delhi, of course, is one of the major sources of pollution in the Yamuna. But there have also been some initiatives taken up in Delhi by basically the national government. And they have been trying to restore the Yamuna floodplains in Delhi to bring back the pristine Yamuna floodplain vegetation and also reinforce the climate resilience angle of Yamuna, of the floodplains basically, for flood mitigation in the city. Basically, the short duration, high intensity rainfall, like something that happened today also, which leads to a lot of flooding in the city once in a while. So the initiative that I'm talking of is something which was initiated by the Delhi Development Authority in collaboration with Center for Environmental Management of Degraded Ecosystems, which is in the University of Delhi. The entire initiative follows a landscape-based approach to rejuvenate the floodplains in an area which was totally a salt pan, and only halophytes, which are salt-tolerant plants, used to grow over there. This has happened because of the extreme amount of land use change and the kind of waste dumping, etc., and changing the water characteristic of Yamuna that has happened over the years. So this initiative was taken up by renowned ecologist, Professor C.R. Babu, to bring back the original vegetation and restore the area. So this is an initiative which was started in 2008 no, just a second, 2002. The Yamuna floodplains, this started as 2002. And now the area holds pristine Yamuna floodplain flora. There are so many faunal species which were not seen for ages in Delhi, which have come back to the extent that a free roaming leopard was also there in that area for 2 days. Of course, then the forest department had to catch it and release it somewhere else because of security issues, because it could go into community areas otherwise. So this is an example of how the floodplains have been restored. Seeing the success of this, the same biodiversity, this is known as Yamuna Biodiversity Park. The park has now gone into a second phase where it has gone on to the floodplain of 7 times more the size of the first floodplain area. So this is an example of how water is being treated as well as the floodplains are being restored to follow an ecosystem-based landscape approach to bring back the ecosystem quality and the services that the Yamuna used to provide.
It's fantastic.
Very successful model running on its own now.
That's really great. And thank you for explaining, because I wasn't fully aware of the scale of that project and the fact that they, as you're saying, they're going to replicate it now 7 times the original area. But I'm wondering, Dr. Sen, if you could speak to, you work day in, day out with local governments and industry to restore rivers and to protect biodiversity. And here we're trying to understand and get to a point where, what is the role of faith-based actors in this space? And I'm wondering, how can we encourage, or what are the mechanisms, or what is the language we need to be using so that faith-based organizations and leaders can effectively advocate and engage with governments and private sector? So not just in the case of the Yamuna in Delhi, so not just that the floodplains are restored, but actually the river is restored herself, but also in other rivers in India. Can you give some sense of what you think could be effective? And I'm asking this question because this, as Maharaj Ji has done this work for many decades, but now we're really coming into a very critical time when it comes to climate change. We see the record temperatures in India at the moment, and we're going to see the importance of water for people's livelihoods and safety and well-being. So now we're entering into this critical phase of climate change and biodiversity loss. How do we, from a development perspective, which is what you represent, how do we have the faith actors and development spaces engage more effectively?
Faith-based organizations play a very critical role now. One of the major reasons why the ecosystems are degrading, not just rivers, a lot of other ecosystems are degrading, is because we have lost touch with our traditional values. As urbanization has come in, more and more people are just losing touch with the traditions which had bound us to all these natural areas. They were considered spiritually very, very effective. There were cultural values attached to it. And there was a lot of traditional ecological knowledge as well, which was attached to each of these natural ecosystems. Faith-based organizations play this critical role of reviving these values amongst youth as well as the community to bring back what our ancestors used to think about these natural resources. Today, if you talk to several youth, Maharaj Ji will know better, but if you talk to several youth, I don't think you will get the perspective of the river being looked at as divine. That was something which we used to look at when our ancestors used to be there. So that is what used to probably stop them a lot from throwing garbage or sewage into the river, because it was considered divine. Today, that feeling of things being divine, having spiritual value, has really gone down. Youth are no longer associated with it. Good or bad, urbanization has caused this. So it's the faith-based organizations which have to build back this connection of spirituality, culture, and value between the citizens and the ecosystems. That's how the behavioral change will start. No matter how many sewage treatment plants we put up, or no matter how many garbage addressal areas we do, till the time we have this behavioral change back to respecting nature, it's not going to happen. It's something which has to come from inside. The masses have to lead, and faith-based organizations play a very critical role.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I like the point where you're emphasizing, which is comes down to individual attitudes and mindsets in terms of moving this forward. And we know in a country like India, and Geeta, I'd like to come to you with this point. In a country like India, which is multi-religious, has a number of different significant religious traditions going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. We see these tensions play out sometimes, and specifically, you know, when people in the chat are talking about the rights of nature and giving personhood to the Yamuna. And I know, Geeta, you've done some research and writing on this subject, where the Yamuna was given personhood, but then it was thrown out by a higher court because they felt the case was based on only the sensibilities of one religious tradition and didn't reflect a variety of religious traditions. And so I'm wondering, Geeta, if you could speak to that issue of rights of nature within the context of the Yamuna, but also how do we come to a common place recognizing that although the Yamuna may be sacred for some religious traditions, it isn't for others. And so we need to have a common narrative that all could buy into. And as Dr. Sen is saying, at the moment, that common narrative is one of devoid of spirituality, one of devoid of religion and culture. So we need to have a common language around spirituality encompassing all religious traditions and none. I know that's a big ask, but I'm just wondering if you have any insights into that, because I think the Yamuna is a really interesting test case for that.
Sure, Gopal, I'm really happy to speak to that. And I think it's a really important and interesting question, and that India is, in that way, is exploring things that are important, even far beyond the borders of India herself. So to come to the court case is actually a very important point to make. First is that before there were the cases about rights of nature, there were a string of judgments from the Indian Supreme Court saying that the Yamuna is entitled to a minimum level of flow. There have been repeated judgments on this point. The issue is that the judgments have not been enforced. And I think the broad view the Supreme Court took was, well, is this going to add anything? Is this going to change anything that we've already said? And they weren't persuaded that this would be the way forward. Though interestingly, the decisions in the Uttarakhand court, which is the lower courts, created a lot of interest all across the world, the rights of the rivers. And the original case was brought by a Muslim resident of Haridwar, which is one of them, core area where the Ganga flows through. So it wasn't seen that when it was brought as being something that related to, the interests of one particular religion. And it came from a case not even a case, but a decision in New Zealand, which related to a river that's sacred to the Maori community there. And it was an interesting parallel kind of discussion between the traditions that existed in the land from the Maori and the colonial powers and what happened. And there were continual petitions from the Maori saying, this is our sacred river. This is one entity. It's part of our way of life. It's not distinct. It's fundamental for us, and this river is an entity, and it's a living. It has rights. It should have rights, and so the river was given rights. But what was there's guardianship of the river, and the guardianship sits between both the government and representatives of the communities who view the river in that way, the Maori communities. And what happened with the judgments, the river judgments, in the context of India, the Supreme Court, was they gave the central and state governments the duty to look after the Yamuna River. They put them also in the place of parents. So philosophically, spiritually, it created some, there's something that doesn't quite work there. If these are goddesses, and the idea of then putting humans in charge of the goddesses probably needs some kind of thinking through of how that would actually. It was trying to look at legal ways to try and make to create some protection, and I think that was recognized. That was what we was trying to do. But if you're putting the very entities that are responsible for granting the licenses for the industries that pollute and for having the separation, this is our bit of the river, this is your bit of the river, that's not really going to work so well. So you really, if you are going to give guardianship, you need to give it to the people in the communities that are responsible. But it's interesting to see that actually at around the same time, Bangladesh, which has Islam as its official religion, granted all its rivers rights. So there isn't inherently a contradiction or a sense that if you bring in sacred ecology values from traditions, that means that they're competing or conflicting. And so I think it's very much about having that sensitivity towards different faith traditions and how they can work together, and the common interest, because so many, the Yamuna and the Ganga and the Gangetic plain, I can't remember how much of the global population, 1 in 12 I think it is, that rely on them, and 40% of the livelihood of people in India. These are rivers that have huge meaning for and livelihood, and so much importance for such a large number of communities across faith, across tradition, as well as the very deep spiritual connection that's felt, and looking at it from a spiritual practice, that the idea of dharma and essence, and you could say the essence of these rivers is to flow and to purify, and they're not able to do that, and they're also not able to do any of the other functions that they need to be able to carry out. And so looking at a multi-layered perspective where you have different religious viewpoints incorporated, sensitively scientific viewpoints, and law all working together, you could come up with some really interesting and creative ways forward. So I don't think that it's at all automatic that taking this approach is going to favor one community over another. And in fact, I think it could create some really positive precedents and ways forward for how to manage that, when it's just not only one community engaging with a river with one particular perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Geeta, for synthesizing that and showing the examples from different cultures from different countries from across the world who are moving in this direction of a rights of nature approach, and recognizing that we can synthesize and we can harmonize these worldviews and these frameworks and understandings to get to that point where we can all look at something as sacred from our own different vantage points of what our theologies and philosophies tell us. And your point, which I only learned about recently as well, that, as you mentioned, 1 in 12 people in the world, not in India, in the world, are dependent on the Ganges, or the what's the phrase, the Ganges basin, the river Ganges basin. So all the tributaries and so on are dependent on those tributaries and that basin for their livelihoods. 1 in 12 globally, not just in India. So there's a real need, as we're talking about, of stepping up advocacy, stepping up in terms of policy and legislation, so that we can protect these rivers. And Shivatsa Goswamiji, I'd love to come to you, picking up a point that Dr. Sen was referring to, which is that we have lost our traditional values and in some ways our traditional ways of doing things. And you, in many ways, are a custodian of hundreds of years of traditions. Starting with the establishment of the Radharaman Mandir there in Vrindavan by the Goswamis, and in many ways this isn't just an issue in India; it's an issue, I think, right across the world, where materialism, consumerism is very much the religion of the day, and where greed is good, and self-restraint or tapas or tapasya is considered to be an old idea, which is not sexy or cool anymore. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to, because I know you do a lot of work in terms of traveling around the world, teaching and encouraging new generations of people to take on a spiritual lens when it comes to their work. How do we, for the youth in India, but also or Hindu youth or people from other religious traditions, how do we encourage or instill this sense of the sacredness of the natural world, which is so important to get to this point of restoring not just the Yamuna, but all of our ecosystems?
First of all, it cannot be overemphasized, but we will have to show to our younger generation that how Yamuna is crucial, not just for the spiritual dimension of our life, but for the life cycle and economic and many other factors, dimensions, which Yamuna becomes the lifeline. That is the starting point. But it has to have a solid foundation of understanding of the spirit of Yamuna. If that spirit of Yamuna is understood by the younger generation, then Yamuna can become healthy and young again. And for that, what I want to point out, that if we just follow judiciously the ritualistic do's and don'ts with regard to, say, Yamuna. So, a lot of grounds can be achieved. Like the temple ritual, there are two kinds of water. There is a sacred water, and then there is a pure water. Today, the water which is sacred for the ritualistic requirement is impure water. But the water which is physically and chemically pure is not sacred. Let me explain that. The water from river, from ponds, from tanks, from reservoirs, from wells, all the natural sources of water, springs, they are good for ritualistic requirement. They're good. But the water which is coming and sucked from the heart of the Mother Earth, that mechanically drawn water is impure and insufficiently pure water. Chemically, you will say that is the most pure water which is available coming from 500 feet below the ground. It is one of the purest water. But the purity, the essential purity, the spiritual purity is lost. For example, if you make it mandatory, as it was till very recently, that only the river bodies, the water bodies, the natural water bodies, water will be used for ritual purposes. If that is mandatory, and that is mandatory for all Hindu religious institutions and rituals, it will be a miracle. We will take care of the bodies. The moment we switched from the natural water bodies to the mechanically pumped water, the natural water bodies started dying, and very rapidly dying. Very rapidly dying. One thing. Second, there is a zero waste system. When you draw water from the natural resources, whether it is well or river, you never draw water more than you require. Never, ever. But when you draw water, but just by pressing a button on a motor starter, pump starter, and you go to sleep, and the whole night the water is being overflowed from your tank. So those kind of possibilities and conservation attitudes and philosophies are in practice if we go back judiciously and understandingly through a scientific understanding of the rituals. If we go back, it is possible. Then the cultural practices, the life cycle events. When a baby is born, it is mandatory for the mother and the father to take the baby to the river. So that is the Hindu baptism. If that is not done, the birthright is incomplete. Birthright is complete. After the marriage, the couple has to visit Yamuna or a Ganga or a well. If the river is not there, at least a well or a tank. There is no cremation in the Hindu tradition which is not on the side of the water. So if we go back and again link water with our life cycle events, as somebody just said, that the Maoris called the rivers as their way of life, and the rivers as the sacredness of the river, in the same spirit. So in the same way, when for time immemorial, the Hindus had respect for Yamuna as a goddess. Yamuna Maiya ki Jai. The river was pure. But when we were caught in the trap of secularism, when Yamuna transited from being a goddess and a sacred water body to a natural water body, just a water body, we can see how in the glorious 75 years of so-called independence, we have systematically not only polluted, but killed the rivers. And I'm sorry to say, but I can share this with the panels. I cannot say this openly in the public because that will be a very damaging thing for me to say. Because 10 months, there is not a drop of Yamuna water in Vrindavan. And what we are performing the rituals with is a pure sewage, urban sewage, which we are taking as sacred Yamuna. So you see that if we respect, we give respect to the river, it thrived, it survived, it sustained itself for millenniums. But the moment we treated this with a physical scientific point of view, that it is a flowing water body, period, finish. We finished with it. We did away with Yamuna. And physically speaking, there is no Yamuna in Vrindavan for 9 to 10 months. It is only the pure sewage water of Delhi and other cities, which is happening and coming to that.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. And you answered my question without me asking the question. My question around inner restoration and outer restoration, because we have this understanding that the outer world is a reflection of the inner world. And if our inner world is polluted or corrupted, then that is the world that we will create. And I love your framing of having a spirit of the Yamuna and living by the cycles of the water and the rivers. And by imbibing this spirit, we can not only lift ourselves up spiritually, but also do the work of restoring the Yamuna-ji as well. So thank you for highlighting that. I'd like to go to Dr. Sen because there are some very practical questions that are coming in as well, and I want to get to them. We have 15 more minutes, so if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but we'll try our best. And Dr. Sen, there were two questions, and I'm hoping you can answer them together. One is, how do we bring transparency in the monitoring and reporting of the work that's happening with the rejuvenation of the Yamuna? I think many people don't know exactly what's going on. And so how do we bring more transparency to the actual work? And then a second question is, can pressure be put on the Haryana government, the question is because a lot of the water is being diverted for the growing of basmati rice, which doesn't naturally grow there. And we had spoken about this before, Mona Lisa Sen, that because of the way the legal system is in India, each state has its own laws. And so it's hard to kind of like have a policy for the whole river because it passes through a number of states. And so I wonder if you could speak to them about like what pressure can we put on the state governments, and also how can we put in processes or systems where it's more transparent so we know what's actually going on the ground.
Right. So this is where the citizens fora and organizations play a very big role. How many times is it that we, since India is a democracy, that we vote for someone who is working for the environment? Do we really think about choosing a leader who's working for the environment when we go to vote? We don't. If we are not choosing such leaders, then how are we thinking that the leaders whom we are choosing will be accountable for any kind of pollution abatement in any river or any land, anything? Democracy gives citizens the right to put their demands forward. Why is it that we do not have a citizens movement by now, wherein pressure is put on the political parties, no matter which party is involved, pressure is put on that party to look at ecosystems, rivers, forests, as our saviors, as our spiritual ecosystems, and give them higher priority than just maybe defense and any other thing. I'm not saying those things don't need priority, but why is it that environment is not getting that kind of priority? If we as citizens feel that environment needs to get priority, it's high time that we start putting the pressure back through the democratic system that we have, so that our leaders understand that tomorrow will not be a day when they will get re-elected if today they do not put their resources and minds to conserving the natural resources that we have. That's the only thing. Once we do this transparency, everything builds it. Today, the citizens are not questioning what the things are happening on the environment sector. That's how things are not transparent, or even if they're happening, we're not aware of it. It just remains in various nooks and corners. It's a full citizen movement that is needed. Democracy gives us that right, and we should be using this.
And I'm wondering, Dr. Sen, just to follow up on that, I mentioned earlier the heat waves that are currently in India. We now know a lot of cities, particularly in the south, are the water scarcity, such as in Bangalore and other cities, is becoming more of an acute issue. Are you seeing shifts in that direction of more citizens being more concerned about the environment and legislation and policy? Are you seeing those kinds of shifts, or are you still seeing a level of inertia when it comes to that?
There is a level of inertia. I agree with that, but there is a slow and steady movement coming up wherein citizens are maybe not really questioning their leaders or the government, but they are, as a collective initiative, coming together and trying to do their small bit to conserve maybe just their society, but the greenery in their society or something in their society. So these are smaller initiatives which have now started coming up, but this now needs to form, a kind of a bigger movement, something like maybe, independence struggle is a wrong example to give, but then that was something wherein everyone united for one common cause. That is what the stage this has to lead to, wherein then our leaders, our common man, everybody will be thinking of environment, of ecology, of the rivers, their spirituality, their cultural value, etc. So this is the movement which now has to build up. It's slowly gaining momentum, but it needs to gain momentum at a much faster or a rapid way.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, and the comparisons to Gandhi and independence struggle aren't lost, because this is a moment where not just the citizens of India, but the citizens of the world really need to stand up to vested interests, let's say, if we are to restore ecosystems and have a healthy planet for future generations. And as we move into closing remarks, Geeta, I'd love to come to you, and one question that we're really interested in is how do we maintain a level of enthusiasm or optimism or hope given the current state of affairs? We are in a difficult situation. The next decade is critical when it comes to restoring balance to the natural world. And Geeta, I'm wondering, you're wearing a hat of a lawyer, as an advocate, but also as a Hindu devotee, as someone who goes to India on pilgrimage regularly. How do you, wearing those different hats and any other hats that you may wear, how do you maintain that enthusiasm and that optimism in the face of what we're facing right now?
Thanks, Gopal. Well, I think actually this is where the spiritual and traditional perspectives are so important, actually, because with activism, there can be a risk of burnout. There can be the risk of it's all on my shoulders. This is all down to me. And all traditions, including the one I'm raised in, are here to help us navigate our path through life, navigate the uncertainties, navigate the obstacles that sometimes we can't pass. And, climate change falls within, and environmental and the kind of destruction we're seeing falls within very much that frame of types of activities. And so there's so many tools. So looking at the tradition that I'm from, of course, they're meditative practices, contemplative practices. There's the idea within the Gita that actually I'm named from of taking action and then surrendering the results. So not being so invested in I have to know what my particular part is, to trust that your part is part of a bigger tapestry and that you can act in concert with other people and that everybody is doing their part. And also the idea of bhakti and love. I think there's so much, particularly with the Yamuna, there is so much of the activism that comes from this real sense of love. And I remember when I was researching this, looking at this idea of saying that, okay, the countenance, the polluted view that we see of the Yamuna is reflective of the age that we're in, where there's so much pollution and destruction, and the connection with her as a river and the service to her as a river enables one to see her in her real form that is never actually impacted by that level of pollution. And it's a very different approach. It's a very connected, deep approach that, however much advocacy in the form of science and policy is powerful and makes points, it doesn't reach the heart in the same way. And I think having that love connection and that exchange is powerful and important for the way that we do our activism. And so connection with the rivers, with nature, and having that reciprocal sense is something that really, really can lift activism, and why I think it's so important not to separate these approaches and how we do things, and how I try to see in my work, I try and see it as service, all of that as service, the different ways in which it is presented. And then understanding there's a long view, we are here, we're playing our part, but actually long term, the rivers and the planet can never really be polluted or destroyed, because that we don't actually have that within our capacity. We can destroy them for the time that we're there, but we can't actually inflict the kind of damage that would, have those. So I'm not saying by any means that means that we should not do anything. We should do things, but having that wider kind of cosmological understanding can also help us navigate some of this and what's our role, and not either become so dejected that we do nothing, or that we just get so invested that we're actually destroying our own ability to take part in the struggles. And I think spirituality and these traditions and philosophies have such an important role in enabling sharing some of the approaches that can help with advocacy and environmental campaigning.
Yeah, thank you so much, Geeta. That sense of balance that is so important as we go through the coming years and really put our best foot forward in trying to address these issues. Dr. Sen, I'd love to come to you next with the same question. You are working with city governments right across India. One can only imagine the level of bureaucracy and the hoops you must have to go through in order to do the work that you do. And how do you maintain a sense of enthusiasm, optimism, and hope as you see the challenges that these cities in India and these rivers and other ecosystems are facing in India? How do you maintain that positive attitude?
Like I said, it's not that things are not happening. There are things on a smaller scale which are happening, which keep your enthusiasm and your faith alive that things are moving towards improvement. Also, then we have to understand that we're looking at India, a country which is probably going to be very soon the highest one in population globally. So it has its own developmental challenges. We cannot become any Western world country overnight. Population pressures in entire Europe are not at all equivalent in any way to what we have in India. So like I said, there are smaller initiatives which happen at the city level and at even lower levels, maybe at a village level or at a community level, which keeps your faith going that such movements are happening. And like I said earlier, slowly we are seeing a rise in such movements. What is needed is a platform to integrate these movements together so that it becomes an initiative which is, which runs across the country in one go. And that is what, the day that happens, that's what things will change drastically. So while we struggle, I find a lot of people doing a lot of work. There are several champions in each city who are trying their level best to make life in the country as well as on the earth a lot better. And they're working for it selflessly. So that's what keeps our spirit going.
No, thank you, Dr. Sen. Yeah, looking at the sparks of hope, where the good work is happening, looking at the people who are doing the good work is certainly a way that we can maintain our enthusiasm for the work. And finally, we are almost out of time. And Shivata Goswamiji, would like to come to you for the final closing. Is the same question, which is, again, you've done this work for many years. You've worked right across the world with different religious actors and government bodies, development agencies. Now you are there on the banks of the Yamuna right now. How do you maintain enthusiasm and optimism for this work going forward?
Actually, the answer lies in 3 words, which are just behind you: spirituality and value and customs. So we have to reconnect to our cultural and religious customs and values. That is the key, that is the trick. And all the speakers have already spoken about it. But how? How is it possible? How to keep that momentum going and how to make it really a possibility? It is a responsibility, in my understanding, as has been emphasized earlier also, of the faith leaders, because somehow still, despite the secular, so-called secular structure of power, the faith leadership is still at the top of the pyramid of power, even today. Even in the secular politics of India, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the decision makers, the development forces, they all have alignment with some or the other faith tradition and faith leaders. So it is the responsibility of the faith leaders to fire that spirit for Yamuna, or that love for Yamuna, as Gita Ji so beautifully said, that unless there is a prem and bhakti for Yamuna, nothing will materialize. Nothing will materialize. Who can do that? The gurus, the mahants, the Goswamis, the swamis. It is their responsibility. The onus is on them. And what they can do as a practical thing, they can have a Yamuna Smriti, a code of conduct book. And I tell you, the Indians may not subscribe to the Constitution of India with faithfulness, but if their guru says something, it cannot be violated. And this country is 99.9% run by faith. So if the gurus take the responsibility and prepare a Yamuna Smriti, do's and don'ts, which had been a tradition earlier also, but now it has to be reworded, rephrased, and presented in the modern context, scientific context. And if it comes from the gurus and the ashrams and the temples, then the miracle can definitely happen. And lastly, through the forum of the religious institutions and leadership, we should share the good news. There are a lot of good news which are happening about the seva of Yamuna, for the restoration of the youth of Yamuna is happening, but those good news are not shared. So using the religious platform and the social media, this good news should be shared. As I was sitting in this panel, I was seeing that how many people have informed in the chat box. They have given such wonderful information about things which I never knew. So if we can share the good news, then I think the momentum can get strength. And thank you so much, Gopal, for letting me come into this panel and learn so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharajji, for your time and your words and your wisdom. It is our honor that you were able to join us today. And thank you also to Gita, Dr. Mona Lisa Sen, and Atul Baghai, who unfortunately had to leave early for some other pressing matters. This has been a wonderful conversation. And as I said at the top, these conversations, these dialogues that we're doing are to see if we can point to possible solutions and pathways for multi-stakeholder engagement around the restoration of ecosystems through the lens of spirituality, values, and culture. And you know what, there was so much to take from this, and I'll have to go back many times just to get everything. But 3 key points that came out for me were engaging citizenship, as Dr. Sen was saying, engaging people at the grassroots, making sure they are engaged and know what's happening. Gita, your point around the rights of nature and try to synthesize a variety of spiritual and religious worldviews in a legal language, in a legal context, I think is so important to move this work forward. And I really appreciated that. And Maharajji, I think you summed it up so beautifully when you said the spirit of the Yamuna, that we have to imbibe that Yamuna consciousness if we are to, as we said, lift up ourselves, but also restore and bring back full health to the Yamuna. So thank you, all of you, for your remarks. There was one question in the chat we didn't get to, which is around how do you engage in this work if you're not part of a religious community? Well, we have the answer, and the answer is that these dialogues that we're doing will be resulting in a handbook that will be released sometime in September. And so that handbook will be available for everyone to use, so they can work with religious actors and government bodies and development sector around this work of bringing this sacredness back into our ecosystems. And so I just want to end by saying that we have 3 more dialogues coming up, one on species, one on food, and one on cities. And if you would like to participate in those consultations and dialogues, please go to the Center for Earth Ethics website, where you can sign up and you'll be notified when those dialogues are taking place. A huge thank you to everyone at the Center for Earth Ethics for hosting this, for all the tech back end, and for a smooth running show, let's say. But for now, we thank you all for joining us on this Monday and wish you good health and hope to be with you very soon again. Thank you all. Bye-bye.